The evening was calm in the city, and the streets carried the soft glow of streetlights. It was one of those nights when people were either rushing home or enjoying a late meal with friends. Among the cars moving quietly through the roads was a sleek black luxury vehicle. Behind the wheel sat a man in his mid-40s. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his tie slightly loosened from a long day of meetings. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as he drove toward his mansion on the outskirts of the city. To most people, he was just another driver. But what nobody could see at that moment was the remarkable story behind him. He was a self-made millionaire, a man who had climbed from nothing to everything through hard work, vision, and determination. As he turned onto a quieter road, the red and blue lights of a police car suddenly flashed in his rear-view mirror. The sound of the siren pierced the calm night. He frowned for a moment, surprised, because he knew he hadn't broken any law. His speed was within the limit, his seat belt was on, and all his papers were in order. Still, he calmly slowed down, pulled over, and parked by the side. He rolled down his window, waiting for the officer. The policeman stepped out of his car. He was tall, with a heavy build, and his expression carried a certain sharpness. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw who was behind the wheel. In his mind, he had already created a story. To him, this well-dressed black man in an expensive car couldn't possibly be a successful businessman. His first thought was that the car must be stolen, or that the man was somehow involved in trouble. Without asking many questions, the officer approached with suspicion written all over his face. "License and registration," he said firmly. His tone was not just firm, it carried a touch of authority that sounded more like judgment. The businessman nodded politely and handed over the documents without hesitation. His calmness only seemed to irritate the officer more. He checked the license, glanced at the registration, then looked at the man as if still unconvinced. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" the officer asked. The man's voice was steady. "I'm heading home after a long day of meetings. My house is just a few minutes from here." The answer was polite, but the officer didn't like it. Instead of acknowledging the response, he leaned closer, as if trying to find something suspicious. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, noticing the leather seats, the expensive watch on the driver's wrist, and the confidence in his posture. To him, it all looked out of place. He wasn't ready to believe that this man could have earned such things honestly. "Step out of the car," the officer demanded. The businessman sighed softly, more in disappointment than in fear. He knew what this was about. It wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment. Even after years of success, after becoming one of the most respected men in his industry, moments like this reminded him that prejudice could appear anywhere, at any time. Still, he chose peace over argument. Slowly, he stepped out of the car, keeping his hands visible, his face calm. The officer walked around him, inspecting the car as if expecting to find something wrong. He checked the trunk, looked under the seats, and even tapped on the tires, but of course, he found nothing unusual. Yet, he wasn't satisfied. His bias was stronger than the facts in front of him. "You're under arrest," the officer declared suddenly. The businessman raised his eyebrows slightly. "On what charge?" he asked softly. The officer didn't answer clearly. He simply gestured with his handcuffs, convinced that he had the authority to act without explanation. To the businessman, this moment wasn't about guilt or innocence, it was about dignity. He could have resisted, but he knew that would only make things worse. So, with the same calmness that had carried him through boardrooms and business negotiations, he allowed himself to be taken in. As they walked toward the police car, a few passers-by slowed down, curious about the scene. Some whispered to each other, shocked at the sight of a well-dressed man being arrested in the middle of a peaceful evening. The businessman noticed their looks but didn't let it bother him. Inside, he was already thinking ahead. He knew the truth would come out soon. He knew the officer had no idea who he was, no idea of the influence he carried, no idea that within minutes this entire situation would be turned upside down. Inside the police car, the air felt heavy. The officer sat with pride, thinking he had just prevented a crime. He looked at the man with suspicion, as though waiting for him to reveal a hidden guilt. But the man only sat quietly, gazing out the window at the city lights. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was simply waiting for the right moment. Because while the officer thought he had control, the reality was far different. The ride to the station was short, but it felt like a stage play. The officer kept glancing at him, trying to read him, trying to intimidate him. But nothing worked. The businessman's silence spoke louder than any words. It was the silence of someone who knew his worth, someone who had faced bigger challenges in life and had come out stronger every time. When they arrived at the station, the officer led him inside with the same arrogance, announcing loudly to his colleagues that he had caught someone suspicious. The businessman stood there, still calm, his hands resting at his sides. The station buzzed with activity, officers moving around, paperwork being shuffled. But for a moment, all eyes turned toward him. Some officers looked confused. Others raised their eyebrows, recognizing his face but choosing to stay quiet. The officer who brought him in, however, remained blind to the truth. He was too caught up in his own assumptions. The businessman thought back to his journey. He remembered growing up in a small neighborhood where opportunities were scarce. He remembered working long hours, studying late nights, dreaming of a life where he could build something lasting. He remembered the struggles, the failures, the people who doubted him. And he remembered how, through it all, he never lost his dignity. That same dignity now guided him in this unfair moment. He didn't need to fight or argue. He knew time was on his side. Because the truth was bigger than the false image the officer had created. In a few minutes, everything would change. The officer believed he was teaching a lesson, but he was about to learn one instead, one that would remind him and everyone around that respect cannot be denied, and real power does not come from force but from truth and character. As the officer began filling out paperwork, the businessman calmly waited. His mind was already clear. He wasn't a victim. He was simply a man living through another chapter of his life, a chapter that would once again prove that prejudice might try to bring him down, but it could never erase who he really was. And as he stood there, he knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning of a story that would soon turn in his favor. The station was busy that night, yet the atmosphere felt strangely focused around one man. The businessman stood quietly near the desk while the officer who had arrested him spoke loudly, as though proud of what he had done. The officer exaggerated his words, describing the arrest as if he had just stopped a dangerous criminal. His voice carried across the room, attracting attention, but the businessman listened in silence. His calm presence didn't match the officer's story, and that made some of the other officers glance at each other in quiet confusion. The businessman remained steady. His suit was still sharp, his shoes polished, and his eyes clear. He looked more like someone walking out of a business conference than someone being accused of a crime. But the officer didn't see that. All he saw was his own assumptions. In his mind, he had captured someone suspicious, and he wanted everyone to believe it. As the officer continued with paperwork, he kept throwing small remarks at the businessman. "People like you think they can do whatever they want," he muttered, shaking his head as he wrote. "Not tonight." The businessman simply stood there, not reacting. His silence was not weakness, it was strength. He knew well that words spoken in anger only add fuel to fire. And he didn't need to prove himself with loud defenses. He had lived too long and worked too hard to let prejudice shake him now. He thought about his journey again. Just a few decades earlier, he had been a young man working 2 jobs, saving every penny to pay for his education. He had washed dishes in restaurants, carried heavy boxes in warehouses, and studied during every free hour he had. People around him told him he was dreaming too big, that success was not meant for someone like him. But he had refused to accept those limits. He studied business, he started small, and slowly, brick by brick, he built his empire. He had gone from selling simple products in a rented shop to owning companies that now employed hundreds of people. His wealth wasn't just about money, it was proof of his perseverance. Yet, standing in that police station, all of that meant nothing to the officer. To the officer, he was just another suspect. That thought stung not because he needed the officer's recognition, but because it showed how blind prejudice could be. Even when success was written on his face and reflected in his presence, someone could still choose not to see it. The businessman studied the officer quietly, almost with pity. He realized that this man wasn't really powerful. His authority was built on a badge and a uniform, but it lacked understanding and fairness. True power, the businessman knew, came from knowledge, respect, and the ability to rise above anger. The officer kept working, trying to gather information, but something about the businessman's calmness bothered him. He expected fear, resistance, maybe even excuses. Instead, he got quiet confidence. That confidence felt like a mirror showing him his own mistakes, and he didn't like it. So he became sharper in his tone, asking unnecessary questions. "Where exactly do you work?" the officer asked, as if ready to catch him in a lie. "I own several businesses in the city," the man answered in a measured voice. The officer smirked, dismissing it. "Sure you do," he replied with sarcasm, tapping his pen on the paper. At that moment, a young officer sitting at a nearby desk overheard the conversation. His eyes widened slightly, recognizing the name on the paperwork. He leaned toward another officer and whispered, "Do you know who that is?" The other officer shook his head. The young officer whispered again, "That's the man who donated $500,000 last year to the community center downtown." The whisper spread quietly among a few officers, but they didn't speak out loud. They watched carefully, waiting to see what would happen. The officer in charge, however, still had no idea. He kept acting superior, blind to the reality unfolding around him. The businessman stood silently, but inside, he was almost amused. He knew recognition would come sooner or later. He had faced many challenges before, and this was just another moment to endure. He could sense the uneasiness growing in the room as more people began to realize who he was. Still, he chose to remain quiet, letting the truth reveal itself in its own time. His mind wandered briefly to his employees, the hundreds of families that depended on his companies for their livelihood. He thought of the scholarships he funded for underprivileged students, the hospitals he supported, and the shelters he had helped build. His life's work was about lifting others, about proving that success wasn't just for himself but for his community too. And here he was, judged unfairly by someone who refused to see beyond the surface. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, but to the officer it seemed like control was slipping faster than he could hold it. The businessman finally pulled out his phone calmly, asking politely, "Am I allowed to make a call?" His voice was soft, respectful, yet it carried weight. The officer rolled his eyes. "Go ahead. Call whoever you think can help you," he said with sarcasm. The businessman dialed a number, his expression still steady. The officer watched, half amused, expecting to see the man beg a friend or relative. But within moments, the tone of the station began to shift. A phone rang on another desk. Then another. Officers began answering calls, their faces changing from relaxed to alert. One officer looked toward the businessman with wide eyes before quickly standing and rushing to the back office. Another officer whispered urgently into the ear of his colleague. The air in the room thickened with tension. The officer who had made the arrest noticed this, but he didn't yet connect the dots. He simply frowned, confused by the sudden activity. The businessman, however, simply returned his phone to his pocket and stood quietly, as if nothing unusual had happened. The shift was clear. Within minutes, the man who had been treated with suspicion now stood at the center of attention for a very different reason. Officers who had ignored him before were now glancing at him with respect, some even with nervousness. The truth of who he was spreading quickly, and the walls of the station seemed to lean toward him, not away from him. The officer felt uneasy for the first time. He didn't understand why his colleagues were suddenly changing their expressions. But deep down, a small doubt began to creep in. Had he made a mistake? Was this man not who he assumed him to be? The businessman's calm smile almost seemed to confirm that thought. The scene had shifted. The businessman still hadn't raised his voice, still hadn't argued, still hadn't demanded recognition. Yet his presence, his calmness, and his quiet strength were beginning to change the room. The officer didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had already started to move. The station was filled with quiet tension. The businessman stood calmly near the desk, while the officer who had arrested him kept glancing around, clearly irritated that his colleagues were suddenly distracted. The officer had expected praise and recognition for bringing in a suspicious man, but instead, the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. Telephones rang more often than usual, and each time one was answered, the officer on the other end suddenly sat straighter, their tone more respectful. Something was happening, and everyone knew it except the man who had made the arrest. The businessman remained steady, his hands folded in front of him. He had made only one phone call, but that single call carried more weight than the officer could ever imagine. On the other end of the line was his personal assistant, who immediately contacted people of influence, business leaders, city officials, even members of the police board. Within minutes, the name of the man in custody reached ears that would not stay silent. One senior officer walked briskly into the room, holding a phone to his ear. His eyes locked onto the businessman, and his expression changed instantly to recognition. He ended his call quickly, then approached the arresting officer. "Do you know who you've brought in?" he asked, his voice sharp but controlled. The arresting officer frowned, confused. "A suspicious driver in a fancy car. Possibly stolen vehicle," he answered with certainty. The senior officer shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "That's no suspicious driver. That man is one of the largest donors to our department. He funds community projects, youth programs, and half the scholarships your own city promotes. He is a respected figure in this city." The room fell silent for a moment. Some officers lowered their eyes, embarrassed by what they were witnessing. The businessman, however, remained quiet. He neither gloated nor smirked. He simply watched, calm as ever, allowing the truth to settle in. The arresting officer's face turned pale. For the first time, his confidence cracked. He looked at the businessman, and suddenly the expensive suit, the polished shoes, the quiet dignity, all of it made sense. But pride is a stubborn thing, and instead of admitting his mistake, he tried to defend himself. "How was I supposed to know who he is?" the officer muttered. "I was just doing my job." The senior officer's voice grew firmer. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to assume and disrespect." Those words cut through the room like a reminder. The businessman could have spoken up, but he didn't need to. Others were speaking for him now, and the officer was learning that his actions carried consequences. Another phone rang, this time at the main desk. The officer who answered it almost jumped to his feet. "It's the mayor," he whispered, covering the receiver with his hand. Gasps and murmurs spread among the officers nearby. The mayor himself was calling the station, demanding answers. That was the power of a single phone call, the weight of reputation, and the strength of influence built over years of hard work. Within moments, the station no longer felt like a place of accusation. It felt like a place of reckoning. Every officer looked toward the businessman differently now. Some with respect, some with uneasiness, and some with admiration. Even those who had been skeptical couldn't deny the truth. The man who had been treated as suspicious was actually a pillar of the community, someone whose generosity had shaped the very city they lived in. The businessman finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I told you earlier I was just going home," he said, looking at the arresting officer. "I had no reason to be treated the way I was. I respect the law. I always have. But respect should go both ways." His words were simple, but they carried power. The officer had no reply. He stared down at the desk, his pride melting into silence. The senior officer turned to the businessman, his tone apologetic. "Sir, we are deeply sorry for this mistake. You should not have been treated this way." The businessman gave a small nod. "I appreciate your words. What matters is that lessons are learned." It was not arrogance that spoke through him, it was wisdom. He knew that anger could humiliate, but calm truth could educate. He wasn't there to destroy reputations, he was there to remind people of dignity, fairness, and the importance of seeing beyond prejudice. Outside the station, word had already begun to spread. Reporters had been tipped off, and camera crews were gathering near the entrance. People on social media were already sharing posts about the arrest of a respected businessman. The story was becoming bigger than the officer had ever imagined. Inside, the officer who had made the arrest began to realize the depth of his mistake. It wasn't just about one man. It was about the image of the entire department, about trust between the police and the community. His pride turned into worry, his confidence into regret. But the businessman still showed no anger, no bitterness. He simply waited, as if letting the world teach the lesson that he didn't need to speak himself. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence that followed. Officers moved with more urgency, answering phones, sending messages, making sure higher authorities knew that the situation was being handled. The businessman stood tall, his presence commanding respect without force. In that moment, he was not just a man, he was a reminder of resilience, of what it meant to rise above unfairness with grace. The officer who had mocked him earlier finally tried to speak. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice softer now. The businessman looked at him, his gaze steady but not cruel. "That is the problem," he said gently. "You didn't want to know." The words landed heavily in the room. They were not shouted, but they struck deeper than any anger could. Everyone understood what he meant. The officer's actions had not come from curiosity or responsibility, but from assumption. An assumption, when mixed with authority, could cause harm. Minutes later, the chief of police entered the station. His face was stern as he walked directly toward the businessman. Extending his hand, he said, "Sir, I want to personally apologize on behalf of this department. This should never have happened." The businessman shook his hand politely. "I accept your apology," he said calmly. "But I hope steps are taken to ensure this doesn't happen to others." The chief nodded firmly. "It will. I promise you." The arresting officer stood to the side, silent, ashamed, and uncertain of his future. His arrogance had collapsed in front of everyone. The very man he had treated as lesser had, without raising his voice, proven himself greater in every way. The businessman finally took a seat, his composure unshaken. He had waited patiently, and now the truth was clear. Power built on disrespect had crumbled, while the quiet power of dignity and reputation stood taller than ever. This was the turning point. In just a few minutes, the roles had reversed completely. The officer who once believed he had control now stood powerless, while the man he had tried to humiliate had revealed his true strength, not through anger, not through revenge, but through the calm confidence of someone who knew his worth. And as the room settled into silence again, everyone understood that this night would be remembered. Not as the night a man was arrested, but as the night truth struck back, and respect demanded to be seen. The station no longer felt the same. What had started as a scene of arrogance and suspicion had shifted into one of unease and quiet respect. The businessman sat calmly on a bench, his posture upright, his expression collected. He did not look like a man under arrest anymore. He looked like someone in control of the entire room, even without saying much. The officer who had arrested him stood off to the side, his pride cracked, his confidence gone. He glanced nervously at his colleagues, but none of them came to his defense. The truth had already spoken louder than any excuse could. Phones still rang constantly, each call adding to the weight of the moment. A lieutenant walked over with a piece of paper in his hand. He leaned down and whispered to the chief of police, who had just arrived. The chief nodded seriously, then turned to the businessman. "Sir, the governor's office has been informed. They are concerned about how this has been handled. I want you to know we are working quickly to correct this mistake." The businessman gave a small nod, his calm voice carrying across the room. "I'm not here to destroy anyone. But I do want to make sure respect is taught. Respect is not something money can buy. It is something that should live in every heart." The words hung in the air, and even the younger officers paused to listen. They were simple words, but they carried more weight than any lecture. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He was reminding them of something they should have always known. The officer who had arrested him shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to defend himself, but every time he opened his mouth, his pride kept him silent. He knew he was wrong, but he also knew that admitting it openly would sting his ego. Yet, deep down, he also realized that this was not about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. The businessman's assistant arrived at the station, carrying a folder. She walked confidently to him and handed it over. Inside were documents, letters of recognition, and newspaper articles celebrating his contributions to the city. Youth programs, scholarships, hospitals, libraries, his fingerprints were everywhere. Without him, many opportunities for the community would never have existed. The chief took one of the documents and read it aloud quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. "You funded the police training academy?" he asked, looking at the businessman. The businessman nodded. "Yes. I believe in better training, better preparation, and better understanding between officers and the people they serve." The irony struck the room like lightning. The very man who had been treated unfairly had invested in the success of those standing before him. It was a reminder that money, when used wisely, could build bridges and shape futures. The media outside had already gathered, their cameras waiting. Word had spread across the city that a wealthy and respected figure had been arrested without cause. The community wanted answers, and the world outside the station was buzzing with curiosity. Inside, the officers grew restless, aware that every moment mattered now. The businessman stood, his presence filling the room even more when he rose to his full height. "Call the media in," he said softly, surprising everyone. "I will speak to them myself." The chief hesitated, worried that the situation would become worse under the cameras. But the businessman reassured him with a calm smile. "Do not worry. I will not use anger. I will use truth." Minutes later, he stepped outside, and the bright lights of cameras lit up the night. Reporters rushed forward, microphones extended, voices overlapping with questions. "Is it true you were arrested unfairly? Do you plan to press charges? What message do you want to give the community?" The businessman raised his hand gently, and the crowd fell into silence. His voice was steady, clear, and powerful, yet without shouting. "Yes, I was stopped and arrested without cause," he began. "But this is not about me alone. This is about every man and woman who has ever been judged unfairly. This is about how we must rise above assumptions and treat each other with respect." The crowd listened intently. His words weren't about revenge, they were about change. He could have chosen to embarrass the officer publicly, to call for punishment or removal. But instead, he chose to take the higher road. "I have built my life on hard work, not shortcuts," he continued. "And I believe in giving back to the community that raised me. Tonight is not about anger. Tonight is about lessons. Let us not waste this moment. Let us build something better from it." The cameras flashed, and the reporters scribbled furiously. People watching on television and social media were struck by his composure. He didn't look like a man seeking pity or revenge. He looked like a leader, someone who could turn an insult into inspiration. When he finished, he stepped back inside. The officer who had arrested him avoided his gaze, shame heavy in his eyes. But the businessman didn't direct anger toward him. Instead, he said softly, "Every mistake is an opportunity to grow. I hope you use this one wisely." Those words carried more power than any punishment. They didn't crush the officer, they lifted him to face himself. For the first time, the officer understood that respect wasn't about a badge or a gun, it was about how you treated people, no matter who they were. Later that night, the businessman sat with the chief and several city officials who had rushed to the station. They asked him what he wanted to do next. Would he sue? Would he demand punishment? Would he use his influence to end careers? He shook his head calmly. "No, I want something else. I want to fund new training programs for officers. I want classes on fairness, dignity, and community building. I want officers to meet the people they serve, not as strangers but as neighbors." The officials were surprised by his response. They expected anger but found vision instead. His request was not to destroy but to build. And because of his wealth and influence, he had the power to make it happen immediately. The chief agreed quickly. "We will launch this program," he said firmly. "Your support will make it possible." And just like that, the power of money, influence, and wisdom turned a night of humiliation into a turning point for the whole department. The officer who had caused the incident would face discipline, yes, but the bigger impact was the change that would ripple through the city. As dawn approached, the businessman finally left the station. The air outside was cool, the streets quiet again. Reporters still lingered, but he simply waved politely and stepped into his car. He didn't need more words. His actions had spoken louder than any headline could. Inside the car, he reflected on what had happened. He thought about how quickly life could turn, how prejudice could still strike even in places where he had invested his heart and wealth. But he also thought about how one moment of calm, one choice of wisdom over anger, could change the direction of an entire story. He smiled softly to himself. Power wasn't in handcuffs or in loud voices. Power wasn't even in money alone. Real power was in using influence to create change, to turn wrong into right, and to guide others toward something better. And tonight, he had done just that. The next morning, the city woke up to a story that traveled faster than the sunrise. Newspapers, radio stations, and television channels all carried the same headline: a respected black millionaire had been unfairly arrested, but instead of lashing out in anger, he had turned the moment into a lesson about dignity and respect. The image of him standing calmly in front of cameras, speaking about fairness and unity, was replayed across every screen. People who had never heard his name before now spoke of him with admiration. In coffee shops, at workplaces, in schools, people discussed the incident. Some were shocked that such a successful man could still face unfair treatment. Others were inspired by how he responded with calmness, wisdom, and strength instead of revenge. The community felt proud that someone of such stature represented them with so much grace. Meanwhile, at the police department, things were no longer the same. The chief of police held a meeting with all officers, reminding them of the importance of judgment, fairness, and dignity in their work. He announced the start of new training programs that the businessman had agreed to fund. "We must do better," the chief said firmly. "We must serve with respect, not with assumptions." The officer who had made the arrest sat quietly at the back of the room. His pride was gone. He felt the weight of his mistake heavier than any punishment. But deep inside, he also felt something change. The businessman's words echoed in his mind: "Every mistake is an opportunity to grow." Those words gave him a chance to look at himself honestly. He realized that power was not in showing authority, but in showing respect. And though it hurt his ego, he knew he had been given a chance to become better. The businessman, meanwhile, continued his daily life. He attended meetings, spoke with his employees, and visited community projects as if nothing had happened. But the truth was, something had happened, a spark of change. People treated him with even greater respect now, not just because of his wealth, but because of his character. He had proven that true strength lies not in fighting back with anger, but in responding with wisdom. One evening, he visited a youth center that he had funded years ago. Children ran around happily, playing games and studying with tutors. When they saw him, they rushed over, calling his name. He smiled warmly, shaking hands, patting shoulders, and listening to their stories. A young boy asked him, "Is it true you were arrested?" The room grew quiet as the children looked at him with wide eyes. The businessman nodded gently. "Yes, it is true. But I was not arrested for doing anything wrong. I was arrested because someone judged me before knowing me." The children looked confused. One of them asked, "Were you angry?" He smiled softly. "No. Anger does not solve problems. I chose to stay calm and show respect, even when I was not respected. That is how we win. Not by shouting louder, but by standing taller." The children nodded, understanding in their own young way. To them, he wasn't just a rich man, he was a role model. He was someone who showed them that no matter how unfair life could be, dignity was a shield no one could take away. As weeks passed, the story remained in people's hearts. The businessman continued to use his wealth for good causes. He funded scholarships, built libraries, and supported hospitals. But now, whenever people spoke of him, they didn't just mention his generosity. They mentioned his calmness, his strength, and his ability to turn injustice into change. At the police department, the new training program began. Officers attended sessions where they learned about fairness, cultural understanding, and community trust. Many officers admitted that the businessman's story had changed their perspective. They began to see that respect wasn't optional, it was essential. The officer who had made the arrest attended those sessions too. At first, he felt uncomfortable, as though everyone looked at him with judgment. But slowly, he began to learn. He began to understand the weight of his actions. He even approached the businessman privately one day. With a humbled tone, he said, "I want to apologize again. Not just for that night, but for the way I saw people before knowing them. You taught me something I will not forget." The businessman looked at him calmly. "Then my experience was not wasted," he said gently. "Use this lesson to help others. That is how real change begins." Those words stayed with the officer, guiding him in the years ahead. He never forgot the night he had arrested a millionaire, only to discover that real power is not in authority but in character. Months later, the businessman was invited to speak at a large city event. Leaders, students, workers, and officials filled the hall. When he stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet in applause. He raised his hand slightly, asking them to sit, and then spoke in the same calm voice he always carried. "I was judged unfairly once," he began. "But I chose not to respond with anger. I chose to respond with dignity. That choice changed the moment. It changed people. And I believe every one of us has the same power. We cannot control what others do to us, but we can control how we respond. And when we respond with respect, we rise above." The hall erupted in applause again. People weren't just clapping for his wealth or his success. They were clapping for his wisdom, his strength, and his example. After the event, a young man approached him. He was a college student, nervous but determined. "Sir," he said, "I was going to drop out of school because I felt the world was unfair to people like me. But after hearing your story, I've decided to continue. If you can face that and still rise above, then maybe I can too." The businessman smiled warmly. "That is the spirit. Never let the world's judgment decide your worth. You are more than what others see at first glance. Prove it with your actions." The student left with renewed hope. and the businessman felt a quiet joy inside. That was his true reward, not money, not fame, but the chance to inspire others to keep moving forward. In the end, the story of that night became more than just an incident at a police station. It became a symbol of strength, dignity, and wisdom. The businessman had shown the world that money can build, influence can guide, but it is character that truly defines a person. As he stood in his home one evening, looking out at the city lights, he reflected on everything. He thought about the struggles of his youth, the long hours, the sacrifices, and the doubts he had faced. He thought about the unfair arrest, the humiliation, and the officer's arrogance. But he also thought about what followed: the respect, the change, and the inspiration. He smiled softly, whispering to himself, "Respect is the greatest wealth of all." And with that, he turned away from the window, ready to continue his work, ready to keep building, ready to keep inspiring. Because his story was not about one night, it was about a lifetime of turning obstacles into opportunities, and using the power of money, influence, and dignity to make the world a better place.